Welcome back to The Journey, a conversation series from Collegiate Sports Associates featuring leaders from across the intercollegiate athletics and professional sports landscape. In this episode, CSA Senior Consultant and former University of Virginia Director of Athletics, Craig Littlepage, sits down with Craig Robinson, Executive Director of the NABC. Craig Robinson was a standout men's basketball student athlete for Princeton University and spent 8 years of his career as a head basketball coach for Oregon State and Brown University. In this episode, Craig Littlepage and Craig Robinson reflect on their shared time together in the Ivy League and discuss the evolution of the game and all that's to come. Paige, take it away.
Welcome to another episode of the Journey. My name is Craig Littlepage, and I'm today's host. Really pleased to have the opportunity to have with me joining the conversation today, Craig Robinson. Craig's been the executive director of the National Association of Basketball Coaches, the NABC, since July of 2020, and we're going to talk some about that role. But I think as importantly, or more importantly, maybe, Craig has had just a fantastic and diverse career with a number of different roles, including as a professional athlete, a professional basketball player overseas. He's been in the private business sector. He's been a college coach. He's been an NBA executive, and he's currently the leader of the National Association of Basketball Coaches. So, Craig, in welcoming you, it's great to see you again. We see each other maybe once a year, usually around the Final Four, but we've had on and off for the past several months conversations about getting together and for you being able to share some of your expertise for aspiring coaches and administrators that sometimes may either be thinking about a career in college athletics or in the early time frame of their ascension into different roles, whether they be coaching roles or administrative roles. So maybe just take us through some of the steps along the path in the life of Craig Robinson.
Well, I sure will, Coach. And first and foremost, thanks for inviting me to be on. This is an absolute pleasure to be able to spend some time with you rather than just shaking hands at a convention or at a game or something like that. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here. And I just want to let your audience know I'll slip between Craig and Coach because I know you as Coach Littlepage from the University of Pennsylvania many years ago. So,
we can talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later. So let me start by just saying that most people know I grew up in Chicago on the South Side and attended public school all the way up until high school, where I went to a Catholic high school called Mount Carmel High School. And the reason for the switch is my parents wanted me to get the best education possible. And at that time, that was probably the best education for me. Academically, it turned out to be a great social background for me and a great athletic background for me. And I was fortunate enough to play for some good coaches and get recruited to play at a lot of different universities and ended up choosing Princeton University, where I ran into you at Penn, which was the absolute just a treasure of experiences at Princeton that really changed my life. That was one of those first decisions that changes your life. And from there, we had we had some good results there, and I was able to develop into a draft pick for the Philadelphia 76ers and didn't make the team, but I was as you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be able to go overseas and play for a couple of years. And this was before guys were making a lot of money. So you never thought of yourself playing over there for 10 years, especially with a Princeton degree. So I came back and started working in the private sector and ended up in the financial side of things and went back to business school at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. It's now called the Booth School of Business, got my MBA and worked in investment banking, sales and trading for about 14 years. And that sort of is my background. It didn't get me to where I am today, but that gives you a little bit of a feel for how I got started.
So clearly, sports has had a significant role in your life and your ascension from an academic standpoint, from a business standpoint, a career standpoint, et cetera. But in addition to sports playing a significant role, I would imagine that there were a lot of folks along the way that I would call influencers, mentors, coaches, and so forth. And I know a little bit about your story and how close a family you grew up in. But who were some of those other, or who are some of the influencers that were really instrumental in you being able to make these progressive moves?
Yeah, well, you said it, Coach. My parents were really my first influencers, my first coaches, my first mentors, and it was an interesting upbringing for me. And I have, as most people know now, I've got a younger sister who's relatively famous, and so what I will say is my parents never really emphasized athletics. They emphasized education, number one, and doing your best at whatever you're doing, number two. And then if you happen to be interested in sports, that would be number three. And you could use intertwine the advice in all three. But what I will say is that every night that my dad came home from work, and when I was old enough to have a catch with him or shoot baskets, he would do that. And he would do that with not only me, but my sister, right? So there was no delineation in the upbringing for either one of us. It was whatever Craig could do, Michelle could do. Whatever Michelle could do, Craig could do. And it didn't matter if it was reading or learning how to tell time or if it was throwing a baseball around. That was it was for both of us. And so that was those were my first memories of athletics, and again, it was never sort of you're going to use athletics for anything in this world. It was always your education was going to get you wherever you wanted, and the way you treated people and how hard you work were going to get you to where you wanted to go. And I just happened to be good at sports. I played all the sports growing up. I played Little League baseball. I played pickup football. I played ice hockey, if you can believe that. They used to freeze the park that was right by my house. And in the wintertime in Chicago, hockey was big, and it didn't matter what neighborhood. I mean, kids were playing hockey in black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods. It was just part of the upbringing. And when I think back to people who were important in my life who weren't my parents, I had uncles who played sports. I had family members who were musicians. So there was a village of talented people around us. But then when I got to when I got into organized basketball, there are two coaches, and I've had wonderful coaches coming up, but my first real coach was Bob Hambrick, a guy who coached at Simeon High School in Chicago, and that was a high school that was famous for Derrick Rose having been there. And they were good, and that high school wasn't in my neighborhood, and it wasn't academic. It was a vocational school, so I knew my parents weren't going to let me go there just to play for Coach Hambrick. But he was like a youth coach for us at the YMCA. So this was before this huge thrust into AAU basketball. So he was my first coach. And then Johnny Gage was a guy I played with at the Martin Luther King Boys Club. He was my second coach. Those were my first two coaches who weren't my parents, right? And they, what they did was they made me believe that I could be a good basketball player. And that, as you know, Coach, is as important as having the actual skills to be a good basketball player. Finding coaches who cared enough about you to coach you hard and develop you. Those were my first two coaches. And then obviously moving on to high school, I had a very good high school experience at Mount Carmel, which allowed me to get recruited to play at Princeton for a brilliant basketball mind, Pete Carril, who I just can't say enough about. He really taught me the game and how to play it and how to look at the game. And if it wasn't for him, I would never have been I would never have gone as far as I did playing basketball.
So am I right that Princeton initially wasn't your top choice?
Oh no. Yeah. That's a completely different story. Yeah. Princeton wasn't my top choice, if you can believe this. And I'll share this story with you and your listeners. I had it narrowed down. Princeton was recruiting me. University of Washington, which was the Pac-8 back then, and they're not even in the Pac-12 anymore. I think they're in the Big Ten now. And it was those two schools, and the University of Texas at Arlington was the third school. Now, I had a fourth school that was Kentucky State. They were the first school to recruit me, but they didn't make the final three. And I went to visit all three schools. And the way the story goes is I was at the kitchen table after dinner, and my dad asked me after I made all three visits. He said, and by the way, just for your audience, this was back when people took all their visits in the spring of your senior year. You were done playing, right? Nobody took visits their junior year. And every now and then you take a visit in the fall if you could, but I wasn't good enough, so I had to wait until the spring and take my visits. And we're sitting at the kitchen table, and my dad says, "Well, what are you thinking?" And I said, "Dad, I think I'm going to go to the University of Washington." Now, my dad did what dads do when you have made the wrong decision. So he put his head back, all the way back, and I know you're going to have people listening to this who may not see it, and then he put his chin on his chest like this, and that was a sign in our family when my dad was upset. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, how could he be upset? I'm going to go to school. I'm going to play basketball in college. So he said to me, well, tell me, how did you come up with your decision? And I said, well, when I went out to visit him, they had engineering, which was what I was going to major in. They had a really good team that I thought I'd play pickup with those guys. And I said, maybe by my junior year, I might get some playing time and even be playing. And I said, and the third thing is that it's free.
Right.
Because as you know, Coach, the Ivy League, you had to pay something if your parents had a job. And back then, the tuition was like $13,000, which sounds like a bargain today. But our contribution was like $2,200. And that sounded like $2 million to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I said, and it's free. And my dad said, just like this, he said, and let me digress a minute. You probably remember this, but just for your listeners, my dad had MS, and he walked with a cane, and it got progressively worse as he got older till he had the crutches that go behind your biceps and that you hold on to. But he went to work every single day, working as a laborer for the city of Chicago water department. And he said to me, if you pick your school based on how much money I have to pay, I'll be disappointed. And when he said he'd be disappointed, the whole house was disappointed. I mean, my mom was disappointed. My sister was disappointed. We all knew he was disappointed. And he said, why don't you think about it overnight, and then we'll talk about it tomorrow. And the next day comes, and the scene is still the same. We're in the kitchen. He said, did you think about what I said? And I said, yeah, I did. And he said, well, what did you come up with? And I said, I did kind of like and before I could get out the instant, he said, fine, slapped his hand on the table. You'll go to Princeton.
So, yeah, I could appreciate those kind of stories because my family as well was oriented toward, education and the very best education. And I was thinking about a lot of the local Big Five schools. And when the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton came along, that did change the dynamic a little bit.
And see, I didn't know. I'm from Chicago. I had heard of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I didn't even know who else was in the Ivy League until I went to visit them. And so, but what makes that story so wonderful is that neither one of my parents went to college, but they knew better and they were parenting, right? They weren't trying to be my friend, right? They wanted me to make the decision, but they weren't going to let me make the wrong decision.
Right. So, and you mentioned Coach Carril.
Yep.
One of the all-time great coaches. I don't care what the level is and, what era it might have been in. Do you have a favorite Pete Carril story?
Oh.
Or do you have one that you could tell an audience?
Yeah, that's the rub here. I got to think of one that I can share with the audience. Because people just don't realize he was so colorful and he was so acerbic that most of his coaching was NC-17 rated, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But I will tell this one story because Coach was not the type of guy who would pay compliments at all. I mean, I remember all the compliments I got from him. That's how few they were.
Yes. Yep.
But I do remember that he really liked my dad. And if you remember, I don't know if you ran your program like this. No one ever came to our practices. No parent, not unless they were a recruit who was visiting with his parents. But you couldn't just come to practice and show up and be there.
Right.
And my dad would drive to one game a year. He'd drive out from Chicago. He'd either come with my mom or he'd come with his brothers. And there was one trip he came out, and it was our junior or senior year, because I remember the other guy on the other side of the court from me was Gordon Enderle, who was a great player from Cuba, New York. 6'8", athletic, could dunk, could run, could jump, could play. And Coach Carril, of course, invited my dad to practice. So my dad was one of the few parents who got to come to practice. So the gym is absolutely quiet and empty, except for my dad, who's sitting up in the stands.
Right.
And I remember Coach Carril going over to Gordon. He was so mad at Gordon at this day. And he walks over to Gordon and he whispers to him loud enough for us to hear, but for my dad not to hear. He said, "Are you going to make me yell at you in front of Craig's dad?"
I can see that, and I can imagine that.
And we all were like, "Oh my gosh!" And the reason why I remember that, because it warms my heart, because he and my dad hit it off, because I think Coach Carril viewed my upbringing similar to his, right? Like, he always talked about the kids who were at Princeton were like 3-car garage kids, right? Mm-hmm. And he recruited kids who were not 3-car garage kids. And my family epitomized that in his opinion. And he just thought the world of my dad to be able to send 2 kids to Princeton on the salary that he had and with the disability that he had. And he just always treated my dad better than he treated other parents. And it was a bit embarrassing, but it made me feel proud.
Yeah. So you had a great college career and went on to play professionally, as you mentioned, overseas. You got into the business sector, made a bunch of money, I'm sure. But then you decided to get out of private business. And did you just have that itch that making money wasn't fulfilling to you, and there was this itch to do something that impacted people? What was it that moved you out of private business?
Well, it was really, it was back when I was still playing overseas. The coach that I had, and I played in Manchester, England for the Manchester Giants, which ended up being a different team now, but they were owned by a businessman from a Lebanese businessman who had hired an American as his coach, a guy by the name of Tom Becker. And Tom asked me, he was a big fan of Coach Carril's, and he asked me if I wouldn't mind implementing some of the Princeton offense with our team. And I was like, yeah, sure. And I didn't even know what I was doing, but I just did what I saw Coach doing. And so we put in some of the stuff, and we ended up we were the last place team, and there were 12 or 14 teams. So we were either 12th or 14th. We ended up finishing third that year. And I came back to Princeton on my way back to Chicago. I stopped off to see my sister, see my friends, watch a game, or not even watch a game because the season was over, say hi to Coach. And I told Coach Carril, I said, hey, Coach, I figured out what I want to do. I want to be a coach. And he said, a coach? You don't want to be and he made it a little more colorful than I made it. You don't want to be an effing coach? He was like, look at you. Here you are, a black kid from the south side of Chicago with a Princeton degree, and you can't leave this basketball alone. And that was when I was like, oh my goodness, I'm letting him down. I'm just going to go into the business world and start working. And that's what I did. So I knew at that point that I wanted, there was a nice little niche here for somebody like me who I could fit in that world, but I didn't. I went right to the work world. And then I was fortunate enough to start working in a field where you can make some decent money. And I always thought that, okay, if I can work in this industry until I'm about 45 or 50, I can retire and I can teach 7th grade and coach high school basketball. So that was when I started formulating my plan. Craig, was back when I was just starting to get in the work world. But before I could get through my plan, Coach Carmody, who was the assistant coach at Princeton when I was there and became the head coach at Princeton later on when Coach Carril retired, he got the job at Northwestern University, which is in Chicago. And when he was at Princeton, he'd come into town, and you remember the days you would call on your alums to help you go recruit,
right?
Help you introduce you to coaches. Well, that was me in Chicago. I was like, I know I either played for or against most of these coaches or with some of the younger coaches. So I took Coach Carmody around. And when he got the job at Northwestern, he needed somebody who knew Chicago. And he offered me a job as an assistant coach. And that was when I was able to revisit it again. Now, I wasn't 50 years old, but it was the perfect opportunity to get in at the Division I level at a little later stage. And that's when I made the transition to coaching.
Yeah. So you had a fantastic professional or business career, and assistant coach, head coach at 2 different places, and then you did some work with the NBA as an executive and so forth. But you found yourself in 2020 with an opportunity to head up the National Association of Basketball Coaches, the NABC. What was it that attracted you to that kind of transition?
Yeah, well, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I liked working in the NBA, don't get me wrong, but I still had young kids, and the travel was just it was unbelievable. And my job was, I was the vice president of player development, which and so what that meant was I was in charge of the development of all the players on the NBA team, the New York Knicks, plus I was the general manager of the G League team. So I had 25-ish players under my purview. And so I was traveling all over the country with the big team, with the G League team. I was doing some scouting, looking at players from college because of my college background. So I was on the road all the time. So I was looking for something where I could stay close to the game that wasn't just doing TV, which I had done in between jobs before I had gotten into the NBA. So, and the a couple of coaches called me and said, "Hey, Jim Haney, who was the executive director of the NABC, is leaving. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Ah, man, that sounds like a headache. But who are you interviewing for the job?" And they said, "Well, we're interviewing Dan Gavitt, who runs the college basketball for the NCAA." So I said to them, "Oh, Dan Gavitt is the perfect choice. You guys don't need me." So I was like, Dan's going to get that. He's perfect for it. Well, as it turns out, Dan parlayed it into a higher position within the NCAA, didn't take the job. So those guys called me back, and that was when I started thinking about really thinking intensely about what that job would entail. And what I liked about it was you're still around the game and you're advocating for coaches to the NCAA and in the media, and we fashion ourselves, the coaches, as you know, the guardians of our game. And finally, Coach, what made this really interesting to me was that I really hadn't spent much time on the administrative side in college sports. I was always just coaching and trying to win games and graduate players. So I really didn't know as much as I know now about how all of this works. And what I found out was, the money that comes in from the media deals that most people don't know is that the money for football pays for football and the conferences. Everything else, every other sport, everything else is paid for by the NCAA tournament, the men's tournament.
Men's tournament, yeah.
And that is just it intrigued me that was the way it was, and that coaches didn't have much of a say at what was going on. And so that it was at that point that I started really trying to get the job, and fortunately I got it. And I've been advocating for coaches to have a seat at the table in making some of these decisions and helping the NCAA come up with the right sort of framework for a lot of these changes that we're going through now.
So, Craig, we've had some unusual circumstances that have impacted the nation and impacted regions of the country. And I know that the NABC has been very active in terms of its offer of support to coaches that are in some of the flood zones in the Southeast.
Yeah, Coach, the NABC is just a great group, a great kinship of sort of brotherhood of people who support each other. We've done it with the American Cancer Society and Coaches versus Cancer. We've done it with voter registration. And we do it whenever there has been some kind of catastrophe around the world, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake or in this case, the areas that have been hit by floods. And what we just try and do is come together as an organization and offer support for some of the coaches who are going through some tough times. And we not only advocate for the coaches, but we're advocating for the student athletes as well. So those are just a few of the things that we have done in the past. So we're just not always fighting with the NCAA about rules and scheduling and recruiting and things like that, but we do a lot of humanitarian stuff when we can.
So are there any changes as we look at this uncertain landscape that you feel as though would be really important for us to consider from a national standpoint that would make the experience of the student athletes better, would make the games better from the standpoint of our fans and people that support these athletics programs?
Boy, I think that's a loaded question that we need another whole show for.
Okay.
I think one of the big things that we're proposing, and you heard me talk about a little bit, is instead of us, and you understand this with your time in administration, the NCAA's run on a bureaucratic sort of landscape and process. And I think it's time to move away from that into more of a business standpoint where we can move quickly with all these changes. And maybe instead of having so many committees decide on what's going to happen in men's college basketball, we could have sort of somehow have a commissioner and have an advisory board that can turn on a dime with different things. I think that would help a lot of this stuff when we can.
So it sounds like you're advocating for kind of an autonomous entity that would oversee men's basketball specifically, and maybe football and women's. These various sports could have their own autonomous process.
Absolutely. Okay. And the thing that I because the NCAA tournament pays for everything, it's so important that it happens in college basketball, because I've had coaches from other sports say, hey, I wish they'd stop messing around with college basketball before I lose my job, right? And so yes, that is what I'm calling for, just an autonomous let the practitioners run their stuff.
Right. All right. Last thing before we go to a little bit of a fun exercise. Any quick advice that you would have for, as we talked about earlier, some of the younger people that are in the industry that are looking to either get into full-time intercollegiate athletics work, or people that are mid-careers that are looking to move into higher levels of authority and responsibility?
Yeah, well, for the young folks who are trying to get in, it's just like coaching. You have to just find a way to get in, right? You have to find a way, whether that's volunteering or if that is taking a very entry-level position and just working your way up. Because if you want to be in this world, it's not like going into investment banking. You go into investment banking to make a lot of money. You go into this because you have a passion for sports and are interested in helping young people. Just get in where you can get in. And for people like me who sort of changed careers, that's one of the things that I had to realize was that, I can't. You may have to take a couple of steps back before you can move forward, and that's what I did when I went from being an actual player or a coach into the administrative side. I had to realize that I was going to take a few steps back, but it's been absolutely rewarding. And if you can make a career in this, you're helping young people. You're around the games that you love. And I will tell you, it keeps you young. That's why you look so young, Coach. You're around these young people.
Yeah. All right. So here's the fun part. We're going to do the Mount Rushmore of Princeton University basketball.
Wow.
We're going to come up with 5 or 6.
Okay.
I'll start and we'll go back and forth. Okay. So I'll give my number 1, and that's a no-brainer, Bill Bradley.
Yeah, that Bill Bradley's number 1. I will say, boy, people are gonna be mad at me. I'm gonna say Kit Miller, Chicagoan. He was the center on the team that lost to Georgetown at the buzzer.
Yeah. All right. I'll go with Brian Taylor.
All right. And I'll go with Armand Hill.
Okay. I'm going to go with one that may be a little bit, no, it won't be a little bit because he was a heck of a player. Ian Hummer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Ian Hummer was good. And
really good.
And I'm going to go with Bob Roma.
Okay.
Remember Bob?
Yep.
Another 6'8" guy who could play guard, forward, or center.
Yep. And of course, Pete Carril would have to be on that Mount Rushmore.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a given. But hey, Craig, this has been a fun conversation. I hope that we can do this again over a beverage of our choice and not in the boundaries of a Zoom interview or this sort of thing. The conversation has been great. You've been a wonderful, wonderful person that's impacted a lot of young people, and you have represented college basketball and all the different organizations, entities that that you've been a part of. So thank you for all the good work that you've done, and thank you for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been a blast, and we have to do a part 2 so we can spend some time fixing college basketball.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Greg Robinson.
Thanks, Coach.